I guess the hotspot worked here. Apologies for the delay, gang. Dealing with internet issues on my end. So I just want to introduce everybody here to Dr. Aaron Patton from Purdue University. Hopefully everybody had time to view the live lecture from Dr. Patton on weed management. Certainly any and all questions are fair game for the discussion today here. I'm going to just go ahead and turn the ball right over to Dr. Patton. I know he has some new herbicide update that he'd like to show the group. So,
all right, thanks, Sam. So what I thought we'd start off, just maybe I'll give you an update on some new herbicides that have hit the market and tell you about a few new things as we get going. So I'm going to take over the screen here and share that so you can see. And pull up the presentation here. So I want to give you a little update on some new kind of herbicides that hit the market. So there's several. If we just kind of look in the middle of the screen here, section 2, there's several new herbicides that have made it to the market. We're going to talk about a few of these. We'll talk about Crew and Gemini and Vexus and Sure Power. The last two are not, if we kind of draw a line here, are not registered for use in lawn care. Now, Game On, it cannot be used on residential lawns, but it can be used on commercial turf. So you could use this on a park, athletic field, those kind of things, but not in residential turf. That's a new broadleaf herbicide that's hitting the market. And then Native Clean is an area that really only you can use on kind of areas, maybe you bush hog or you only mow a couple times a year. So we're not going to cover these last two just because they wouldn't really fit for everybody, but we'll cover these first 4 for sure. And then there's also several new herbicides that are just for warm season turfgrass lawns. And since most everybody in the class is in the cool season turf, we'll just skip these today. But if you have a question on these, I'm certainly happy to cover that. You can ask the question in the live chat box or just shoot me an email at some point if you have a question on those, and I'm happy to cover that. So. One other thing, I guess, before I get started is all these new products I'm about ready to tell you about are in the Turfgrass Weed Control for Professionals guide that Sam gave you all access to, the PDF version of that publication. So if you certainly want to learn more about these or check out which weeds they control in more detail, then that will all be available in the publication that Sam provided you access to. So the first one to tell you about just really, it was registered in 2019, but really not sold much. So this one will be something that people might start using this calendar year. And this product is called Crew. Now, the ingredients in this product are not new to the turfgrass industry, but certainly their combination is new to the turfgrass industry. So the first ingredient listed here is isoxaben. That's one that we haven't traditionally used a lot in turf because it was a more expensive herbicide, but that's a pre-emergence herbicide specifically for broadleaf weeds. So think spurge, oxalis, purslane, those types of small seeded broadleafs that might be an issue in the summertime. That ingredient works really well on. And then the second ingredient, dithiopyr, that's a herbicide we use a lot. That's the active ingredient product called Dimension. So this would be a pre-emergence herbicide for crabgrass. So what the combination of these two ingredients together gives you is pre-emergence herbicide activity on both grasses and broadleaf weeds. So this product is particularly good for lawns that might or turf areas that might have both crabgrass issues as well as issues with summer annual broadleafs, again like the spurge or the oxalis or other weeds. It is right now, this particular product is sold only as a granular herbicide. It comes on an inert carrier, and there's no fertilizer associated with it. So another good aspect of this product is if you wanted a pre-emergence herbicide, but you didn't really want to necessarily put any nitrogen down on the site because it just wasn't the right time of year to fertilize the turf, or you were planning on coming back later with a fertilizer, then this would be a good option for that. Now you can use this product, in addition to turf, you could use this product in landscape beds, and so that's why it has many tree and shrub species on the label. All right, now the next product is very much just like the one we just covered, but this one is isoxaben plus a different ingredient called prodiamine. Now you might be familiar that prodiamine is the active ingredient in the product called Barricade. And so same type aspect here. You have isoxaben, which is strong on broadleaf, pre-emergent activity on broadleaf weeds. Prodiamine, strong on pre-emergent activity on grassy weeds. So you put them together, all of a sudden you get a really good pre-emergent herbicide for whether you have grasses or broadleaf as your weed control problem. The other thing that, just like the previous product, it mixes 2 modes of action, which is a good thing for preventing herbicide resistance and so on. But this one is available both as either a granular or over here to the right, you see an SC suspension concentrate. So meaning you could either spray or spread this particular product. And like the previous one, also you can use this in landscape beds as well. So do 2 new products to kind of broaden our maybe the range of weeds that we can control on that lawn site. The next product is called Vexus. Now, this is a brand new ingredient for the turf market. Pyrimidine is a product that has really good activity on sedges. So while there's several weeds labeled, yellow and purple nut sedge and false green kalinga, which is a type of sedge, are the ones that be most prominent, particularly yellow nut sedge throughout basically the whole country. And then false green kalinga is a problem in the Northeast, mid-Atlantic, all the way to about Indiana in the Midwest. And it hasn't really spread much farther west than Indiana and much farther north than Indiana. But this is a weed species, the false green kalinga, that I think will continue to spread and become problematic in some of our bordering states in the future. And then lastly, there's a weed up here called path rush. This is a rush species, a Juncus species, and Juncus tenuis is a scientific name for this particular weed. This is one that, if you don't know what it looks like, kind of looks like a clump of perennial ryegrass. If you have a perennial ryegrass plant that might be growing somewhere that no other ryegrass is growing, for example, ryegrass and bentgrass or ryegrass that might look like it's in some zoysia grass or some other warm season turf. And so just kind of a clumpy species, but it's a rush, not a grass. And you see this mostly in compacted areas. So old walk paths, next to sidewalks and driveways, that kind of thing. So this is a good herbicide for some of these unique weeds. It is a granular herbicide, and it comes in a special shaker bottle, if you will. And so you basically can buy these the shakers and the refills, and it allows you to make a nice spot application of the herbicide on a site, since most of the time we can easily see yellow nut sedge and false green kalinga, and usually they pop up in just little patches. Then this product is a good granular option for spot treating those patches. So they do recommend you water it in within 48 hours after treatment. So based on the weather forecast and whether you have irrigation system on the site or not, then you can figure out how to get that watered in. Now the last, I think, herbicide we're going to discuss, new one is called Sure Power. This product actually came out in 2018, but I thought it would be good to just address it because it has an ingredient in there that we don't normally use a lot in the turf industry, and that's this last ingredient called flumioxazin. Now, flumioxazin is, the mode of action for that is a PPO inhibitor. Okay, so that's a particular enzyme that's in the plants. And so this herbicide inhibits that enzyme, and it does, typically herbicides in this mode of action, they work very quickly. And so this herbicide by itself, when you put it out at a higher rate, actually works to kill most weeds and prevent many weeds from coming into an area. And it also can damage your crop, which in this case is turf. So what the manufacturer has done here is they've really reduced the rate of this ingredient. And the whole reason they're putting this ingredient in the product is obviously based on the first 3 ingredients, you could tell this is a broadleaf herbicide. And what they're trying to do is speed up the activity of that broadleaf herbicide so that not only do you kill the broadleaf weeds, but you kill them quickly. Okay, so this herbicide definitely has quick activity, and the goal of the flumioxazin is to make sure that that works quickly, even though the esters already give a fairly quick activity and control. So, so a neat product, really aggressive set of ingredients here to solve many broadleaf issues. But because of that flumioxazin in there, you also have a small risk of causing some injury, particularly when certain conditions are present. And those conditions, we're learning more about this, but those conditions are basically early in the spring or early in the fall when the grass is fairly lush. And I'll show you an example of that in just a second. Now, another thing to point out before I move on the screen is the second to last bullet point is that because this product works quickly by itself, and you don't need to add any kind of adjuvant. In fact, if you add an adjuvant, your risk of injuring a turf is much greater, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. And then one last thing, though this product is called Sure Power, there's also a formulation or a different product called Tetra by Armortech that also has the exact same set of ingredients. Okay. All right, so next slide just kind of shows you some of the weed control spectrum of this herbicide. So here we're looking at ground ivy control, which we know is a tough to control broadleaf weed. And we see on the left here 3 different rates of Sure Power, all working very well to reduce ground ivy cover. And then compared to Speed Zone or a pint of turf lawn ester or Cool Power, we see this product working fairly well. Although I don't want to dissuade you from a statistics standpoint. So statistically, anything that has the letter C is statistically the same. So technically in this experiment, we show that several things effectively control ground ivy, but you get the idea of the trend that the Sure Power seem to be doing a little bit better job than some of the other products. If we look at other common weeds like dandelion and purslane, we see that whether it's Horsepower or Sure Power or Escalade 2 or Speed Zone, all of them are doing an effective job at controlling the weeds compared to not doing anything at all. So good overall broadleaf herbicide, and would work particularly well on violets and ground ivy just based on the set of ingredients. But if you don't follow directions, then bad things can happen, okay? So here's a site. This was like a hospital grounds in Indiana, and this happened in October, pretty close to when we had the first frost. So the grass was kind of soft and succulent and just had this first frost. And what you see here that I'm circling in red, that's the area that they skipped. So that's what the grass should have looked like. And then everywhere else where the turf turned off color, that's what looked like when they applied this herbicide. Now, in this example, you see that they put the herbicide out at almost double the rate. So they had a mixing error, and that caused this injury that you're seeing here. But what we're encouraging people to do is just be cautious of using this product in the spring or the fall when the grass is particularly lush, because you may get a little bit of turf injury. Now, what I've seen in the past is, particularly in the spring, if you get a little turf injury, once you mow the turf, that injury goes away and you don't notice it at all. But in the case like we have here in the fall, when the grass really is kind of done growing and not really growing a whole lot, then that injury is certainly going to last a little bit longer. So while if something like this were to happen to you, I'd certainly encourage you to get that area mown to try to mow off some of that injury. But in this case, the grass really wasn't growing that aggressively, and so you kind of have to look at that injury for a few more months. And then this is what it looks like if you put an adjuvant in there and you're not supposed to. So you can see some plots here that has some turf injury. And oops, let me go back here. And so here you see this is what happens if you put that adjuvant, that sticker spreader, that non-ionic surfactant in the tank, then you're going to get increased injury from the Sure Power. And so follow the label and don't add that to the tank. This herbicide will work plenty fast on its own. It doesn't need you to add any kind of extra product to the mix in order to make it work better. Now, one thing that I wanted to tell you about is to, let me try to get the, let's see here. Okay. One thing I want to tell you about is a new project that we're working on related to annual bluegrass control. And you're aware that annual bluegrass is a tough to control weed out there. And so we've started this research experiment funded by the USDA to try to learn more about this. And so we are collecting annual bluegrass from across the country. I'm up here in Indiana. Oops, a little too far there. Indiana, kind of in this area here. But if you had, if you were somewhere else in the Midwest and you had some population of annual bluegrass that you had sprayed and you thought it should have died, but it didn't, and you want us to test it, we'd be more than happy to test it as part of this experiment. So generally what we're doing is we're talking to growers, whether it be in the lawn care, athletic fields, sod farm, golf course, And if they are a site where they've tried to control annual bluegrass in the past and it hasn't worked well for them, then we're asking them to help us to collect some plants. And then we will propagate these plants on campus, plant them in some flats, spray them with some different herbicides to see if they might be resistant. And if they are, then we certainly are collecting survivors and doing additional research to learn more about how they might be resistant or what level of resistance they might have. So anyways, if you that's real quick about that project. But if you have a lot of annual bluegrass in the areas you manage, and you've tried a few herbicides to try to manage that and you've had no success, then we'd be happy to maybe help test some of the annual bluegrass populations you might have in your trial. So feel free to just shoot me an email and say, hey, I got some annual bluegrass I can't control. How can I help you with this research? All I would need is you to send me some plants by mail, and then we'll do the testing and follow up with you with the results. And if it looks like you have some resistance, we want to learn more about your sites and what you sprayed in the past. But for most people in the cooler sections of the country, we're not seeing a lot of resistance issues. We're mainly seeing these issues, particularly farther south, where they grow warm season grasses and they have often many other herbicides that they're using different modes of action that are a little bit more prone to developing these resistance issues. And then last thing I wanted to cover here before we jump into some of the Q&A is just a little bit about glyphosate. So you've heard a lot in the news about glyphosate. You may even see some commercials from some lawyers. And so I wanted to give you some of the facts on this. And most recently, the EPA issued a press release that they, after extensive review of glyphosate, something they do all the time with these, or they do, I think, every 5 years for these herbicides. But I think in this case, they did it a little bit quicker because of some of the issues going on in the media. And so what they found, and I've got it highlighted here, there's no risk of basically us using glyphosate. They found that it's not a cancer-causing agent, and we can go ahead and continue to use glyphosate because it's certainly an important and effective herbicide for us in the turf industry. Now, one of the reasons that they made this finding is, of course, they did a review of all the results, but also many other toxicologists have published research recently to also confirm that glyphosate does not cause cancer. So this is a study published in the Journal of National Cancer Institute. So that's our highest journal for basically the medical doctors in the United States. And so they studied over 50,000 applicators of glyphosate and found that there was no association between the use of glyphosate and the incidence of cancer amongst those applicators. So in a study like this, what they do is they compare the rate of people that get cancer that use glyphosate, and they compare it to the rate that people get cancer when they don't use glyphosate. And so they compared those two groups and found that they both got cancer at the same rate, meaning that the added use of glyphosate wasn't causing cancer. So whether it was non-Hodgkin's lymphoma or these tumor-producing cancers, there was no increased incidence in these applicators. So that's good news. It means that we can continue to use glyphosate, it doesn't cause cancer, and so on. But many people that maybe work for your municipality, or maybe the customers that you may have, they probably saw the commercials and now they've asked you not to use glyphosate. So what do you do about that? Well, one, you can share some of this information I've just shared with you with them and just say, hey, did you know that the EPA conducted a risk assessment of glyphosate and found it didn't cause cancer? Did you know that a journal article was published by the National Cancer Institute that said that glyphosate doesn't cause cancer? And you can at least share some of those facts. Say, that's something that the TV commercials certainly aren't telling you about. Now, if they don't believe you, or they say, well, I still don't want you to use glyphosate, then you have to figure out, well, what kind of alternatives can I use?
Well, or Aaron, just to back up for just a second, or what I hear sometimes is, well, I don't trust the EPA, right? I mean, the EPA administrator is an appointed person, and there's some bias there. But I guess, does that bring up the question, how well do we trust the EPA? And I don't know what the right answer to that is. But the second study is good enough for me. So case finished.
Yeah, you have two independent groups. In this case, one the EPA, which remember, it's not the director of the EPA that's appointed by the president that's did the research and is issuing the findings, right? It's all the people that work underneath them at the EPA that actually are qualified to do this type of risk assessment. They're the ones doing this. But you're right. If someone said, well, I think that group's politically charged, then at least they could go to the doctors. But in our day and age, some people say, well, I don't trust researchers. And I hope that's nobody that signed up for this class, because all you're doing is learning from a bunch of researchers here. But so let's say that you share that good information with them, and again, they say, we still don't want you to use glyphosate. What do I use instead? Well, there's 3 or potentially 4 alternatives for you. So I want to say a few things about these alternatives. One of these alternatives, none of them have a lower toxicity portfolio than glyphosate, meaning that they're all either have the same toxicity of glyphosate or they're more toxic than glyphosate. Okay, so for example, Dicot, the second product there, is very toxic to humans, and I wouldn't even want to apply it, let alone make one of my workers apply it. Okay. Second thing to remember is that none of these products that are on the screen here work as well as glyphosate. So all of them are not going to control the weeds as well. And then the third thing is that all of them are more expensive than glyphosate. So all the alternatives to glyphosate don't work as well. They're more expensive, and they're actually more likely to cause injury to the applicator than glyphosate would by itself. But let me just kind of quickly review some of these. So one product, the first one is Finale. That's the trade name. And the ingredient is glufosinate. This is different than glyphosate, okay? But it's glufosinate. So first, I would not tell the customer what the name of the ingredient is because they may think, well, that sounds like glyphosate, but it's not. It's a totally different herbicide. The issue with Finale is that it has limited translocation, meaning it's not going to move inside the plant as well. So one of the great things about glyphosate is it moves inside the plant well, and so it kills the rhizomes and tubers or whatever that's associated with that particular plant you're trying to kill, and kills the parts of the plant you can't see. This particular herbicide would not do as good of a job with that. The second product is Reward with the ingredient Dicot. There's another product called Gramoxone, which has the ingredient Paraquat. You may have heard of that one before. Paraquat is twice as toxic as Dicot. And generally, if we think about toxicity compared to glufosinate, let me do the math real quick here on my calculator. Dicot is 25, has a mammalian toxicity that's 25 times more than glufosinate. Okay, so glufosinate has a toxicity profile similar to glyphosate, and but Dicot is much more toxic to the mammalian applicator than the glufosinate or the glyphosate would be. The other thing to remember about this one is it's what we call a contact herbicide. So what it means is that it is not translocated at all. It only kills what the spray droplet touches. So because of that, it's good for banding, meaning that it kill whatever you spray it on. So if you spray a straight line, you'll have a dead straight line. But the bad news is it would never move into any kind of root tissue or stolons or rhizomes or any other tissues like glyphosate would. And then lastly, they have a product called Scythe. Now this could be considered maybe an organic alternative because the ingredients, pelargonic acid, that's fatty acid, and this one also works like a contact herbicide, and it will not move inside the plant because it's a contact herbicide, but it is an organic acid type ingredient. So some people look at this as a nice natural alternative, but again, it's going to be more expensive and it certainly won't work as well. And then the last one that I didn't list was just basically some high concentration acetic acid. So acetic acid, some people think of that as vinegar, but vinegar is pretty dilute. But this acetic acid is much higher concentration, and it will, similar to pelargonic acid, burn down whatever you spray it on. but a lot of that will regrow because it doesn't translocate into those tissues. And then both of these, particularly the acetic acid, can cause some, or briefly, if you get them on your skin, cause some skin irritation. But if you were to have a long exposure to these on your skin, it could cause some burning. So I know of an applicator where that had applied this with a backpack sprayer, this acetic acid, and the backpack sprayer was leaking and it was running down their back, and ended up having to go to the hospital and get some treatment for some burns since they had extended contact on his skin from this. So all this said, personally, I continue to use glyphosate. I think you should, but if your clients say no go, then to me the best option is this top option as far as a product to go with. But keep in mind it's more expensive and doesn't work as well, so you'll have to figure out how to either increase your cost to your customer, and I would just let them know, hey, this product, this alternative that we need to use is more expensive, so I need to either charge you more, I need you to consider give me a little bit more in my budget to deal with that. And then also know that you will have to make more applications of this product in order to get a similar level of control as glyphosate. So with that, that's what I wanted to share with you on new herbicides, kind of new things, before we had some general kind of Q&A with Sam on some of the questions you've asked.
Question I get quite often from the lawn care or sports turf sector, Aaron, is how long, if I'm going to do a lawn renovation, for example, and I am using Roundup or glyphosate, how long do I need to wait to reseed that type of scenario?
Yeah, that is a common question that we get, because with most herbicides, we're used to having to wait a set amount of time before seeding. But with glyphosate, there's actually no wait time. So you could technically spray glyphosate in the morning and then seed right after that. But I typically recommend just waiting a day or two. But technically, you could do it all in the same day. Generally, we want to spray glyphosate. Let the tissue on the plant, on the turf we sprayed, die, and then get up there and try to either mow off or break up some of that fresh dead tissue on top, so we can have better seed to soil contact, and then get in there and slit seed or aerify or till the site before we seed. So there usually is a delay between glyphosate and seeding, but technically you don't have to delay any time. So there's no seeding restrictions on that particular ingredient, and that's because once it hits the soil, it's strongly bound to the soil and deactivated such that it won't work as a herbicide anymore. So it's glyphosate only works on basically green tissue that you spray it on. Anything else that's going to hit is going to deactivate it. Any other organic matter or dead tissue that it hits is going to deactivate that. It is worth noting, and I kind of try to stop myself and clarify there, that if you spray glyphosate on sidewalks or rock, then the next time you irrigate or you get a rainfall, that glyphosate that you sprayed on gravel or like a sidewalk is still active and can move in to a turf area and cause damage. So where I typically see this is that, let's say that someone, instead of having a mulch bed for landscaping, they've got some decorative stone that they've used in a landscaping bed. And maybe they got a couple weeds popping up in that decorative stone, so they'll spray that. But then if they irrigate or water, then that glyphosate can move off that decorative stone into the turf and cause some injury. It's kind of a rare thing, but just keep that in mind as you're using glyphosate. If you have some large stone areas, then just kind of think about, well, what's downhill from these areas, and might this glyphosate move and cause some damage to those sites.
Question, Aaron, that came in from Colin. He's with a lawn care company in Iowa. I'll just pull it on the screen here. So he says, and this might lead us into some of our general comments about some of the pre-emergent products out there and available as well. So I'm looking at using a product for product that has pre-emergent fertilizer. It's 37% prodiamine. Do you think that's enough of the pre-emergent, or should I focus on a product that is not dual purpose in the spring? Good question, and there's definitely a lot to talk about there.
All right, so Yeah, so thank you for the question, Colin. So when they, when these well, one thing, so you mentioned a product that's 37% prodiamine. It's probably actually 0.37% prodiamine, right? But it's kind of confusing the way that they write these percentages on the label. So my guess, if you look at that product, they say 0.37% prodiamine. So what that means is, yeah, it is 0.37%, not 37%. So, and you probably, if you go to that same store that wherever you're picking up that product, you might find one that's 0.32%, or you might find a 0.25%. And so just remember that percentage, while it's very informative, that it's not make sure I say this accurately. What they're communicating to you is what the loading rate is of that herbicide on the fertilizer granules in that bag. Now, what you'll see is if you study the labels for all these products, they're all recommending a different amount of the product going out onto the turf. And the reason they're all recommending a different amount is they're trying to standardize the herbicide rate that's going out. So no matter which prodiamine containing product you pick, you'll be applying the exact same amount of prodiamine. And so when we go to use combination products, these fertilizers plus a herbicide, they're the most common combination products, then because the EPA regulates how much herbicide can go out on a site, then the labels are all written in such a way that they standardize that herbicide application rate. So does that mean that you totally ignore that number on the label? No, it doesn't, because that label can tell you a lot of things about that product. So for example, 0.37%, if I recall, is kind of towards the higher end of what a prodiamine loading rate might be. So you could go all the way down and find a product that might be only 0.2% prodiamine. And so what should it matter? Well, think about it. If my loading rate is higher on the fertilizer, what that means is there's more herbicide on each fertilizer prill. And so that means I'll actually put out less fertilizer prills on the site when I make that application in the spring. And so what that means is maybe my coverage might not be as good. And so I tend to steer people towards the products that have the lower loading rate, because it guarantees you'll have a better, you'll have more prills out there per area, or a better application uniformity likely if you use one of those products. Now, having said all that, the manufacturers, they know these things. It's not like the first time that they've ever sold one of these. So they've tested all these products to make sure that they think that they'll all perform well for us in a turf situation at these recommended application rates and at the loading rates that they're giving us. But theoretically, a pre-emergent herbicide that has a lower loading rate would give you better control, because you'd be more likely to get improved coverage of the product. So, but the herbicide is only one thing to look at in these products. You want to look at the nitrogen release characteristics in that product. Is this a product that has that amount of slow release fertilizer or the amount of quick release fertilizer that you might be interested in? And generally in a product like this, we're talking about putting it out in early spring when the grass is either not actively growing but it's about to get really actively growing. And so I like products like when we're ever using a pre-emergent on a fertilizer, I like a fertilizer that has a lot of slow release fertilizer in it, because we don't really need to feed the grass that much in the springtime. It's naturally stored up a lot of energy from the previous fall. It's going to grow fast on its own. And so if we put down too much quick release nitrogen in the spring, then we're going to promote a lot of excessive growth. So take a look both at the loading rate, steer towards one that maybe has a lower loading rate and has more of that slow release fertilizer in there. And that's going to be more expensive, but I think you'll get a better result. You'll get a more uniform feeding and better crabgrass control out of those products. And in my opinion, worth the extra cost to get the product that's going to give you a little bit more consistent and higher performance.
Great stuff. Thanks, Aaron. So just to focus on the last part of that question just for a second, and I get to some extent there is a disconnect between you and I talking here about what would be an ideal world situation, and then these guys need to go out there and get it done, for example. So I get the convenience factor, but so the last part of this question, should I focus on a product that is not dual purpose in the spring? And then maybe that leads into a discussion of sort of some of your research around the half rate type of prodiamine type of approach to reduce the pre-emergent wearing off by the time you're going to, or breaking down in the soil by the time you're going to get some breakthrough there.
Yeah. So so we just talked about this in Fargo, North Dakota 2 days ago, right? This are the same questions and same topics we just talked about. So so a couple things there. One, going back to what you said, Sam, do we really need this dual purpose product in the springtime, right? So the answer is we really don't need to fertilize the grass in April because, or early May even often. And most of our locations, the grass doesn't really need a lot of supplemental fertilizer if it's an area that's been cared for in previous years. If it's an area that hasn't been cared for, then we probably need some fertilizer to enhance the density and so on. So do I need a dual purpose product? Probably don't need a dual purpose product. So you say, well, why do we have these products? Well, the reason we have them is because fertilizer is the cheapest carrier for these pre-emergent herbicides, right? We can get these inert carriers that they can spray the herbicide on, and then you can use that to spread the product out onto the turf. But those are actually more expensive than the fertilizer itself. So the reason we use these fertilizer carriers is because it's actually the least expensive way for us to get the pre-emergent herbicide on a granule that we can then go out and easily spread onto a lawn. So one approach is you could pick a product that's either on one of these inert carriers and then come back at a later date and fertilize with a product that's just fertilizer by itself. So you can do that. The other thing you can look at is doing what Sam was referring to, what we call a split application strategy. And what that application strategy is, where you put half your pre-emergent herbicide down at your normal timing. You come back about 45 days later and you put down the other half. And so what you're doing is you're putting the same total amount of pre-emergent herbicide out, but you just do so in a way that you only put half out the first time, half out the second time. And in lawn care, you're typically going back to the site, every month and a half or so anyways. And so it's not extra labor for you because you're already planning on going back to the site and making a future application. And the advantage of a split application is that basically what it does is it gets some ingredient out there the first time to prevent the crabgrass from germinating. And then before that ingredient breaks down too much into the soil that it would allow crabgrass to germinate, then you come back with a second application. And in total, what it does is it extends the amount of time that herbicide's in the soil, so you get slightly better crabgrass control. Our research shows you get about 20% better crabgrass control when you use a split application strategy versus a single application strategy. And if I confused you, then you can read this booklet that Sam gave you access to, because it talks about the split application strategy in the book. And so what about the fertilizer? Well, another advantage of doing this is it would basically get you to put down less fertilizer for that first application when you're using the split strategy, so that you're not putting as much out that first time when the grass doesn't need quite as much at that timing.
And Aaron, I know we certainly are always concerned about being sure we're compliant with environmental regulations, or the law basically, and pesticide labels kind of rule all. So I know, like, from a fungicide perspective, we really focus on hitting that target label rate, 3 ounces per 1,000 square feet. Are there any concerns about going lower than label rate with herbicides, or is it just that maximum amount of active ingredient per acre that we're allowed?
So there's no prohibition from going at a lower rate. There is prohibition from going above that maximum use rate. And most herbicides will have 2 max rates. They'll have a max rate for a single application, and then they'll have a max annual rate. Not all herbicides have a max annual rate, but many herbicides do. So my only concern with going if you go low, you have to know a little bit about the herbicide and the weed. Can I still control the weed at this lower rate? So that's one thing you got to know. And then, so my concern there would be, you're not going to get as good a control, right? So that's why we usually want to follow the label rate, because the manufacturer has done all this research to show this is the rate that works best. And so take advantage of all the hidden research that you don't see that went into that label to say this is the rate that we need to use to get effective weed control. So one concern is that you're not going to get the weed control if you go too low of a rate, below the recommended rate. The other thing is, we know with when our pests develop resistance to the pesticides we're using, we know that resistance will develop most quickly if we went out more frequently with low rates of the pesticide, whether that be a fungicide or insecticide or herbicide. So you're actually increasing the risk that you might develop resistance by going out more often at a lower rate. But what I'm recommending is all label allowable. In fact, many of the pre-emergent herbicide labels give you some specific instructions on how to do a split application approach. So what I'm recommending is certainly within the label guidelines and label application rates. It's just kind of a different strategy in using the herbicides. It's a strategy that's most commonly done in the southern United States, but we're trying to encourage people as they go farther north, and as maybe some of our weather patterns get a little more erratic, and then it's helpful for giving us more consistent weed control in areas where maybe we used to just go out and put a single application down and got really good control for the whole year. But once we get a few hot summers or we get a really wet spring, that might cause a more rapid breakdown of the herbicide, then the split application approach really gives you an increased consistency to your crabgrass control.
Great stuff. So circling back here just for a second. So in the case where it sounded like you're advocating to kind of pull those two products apart, certainly fertilizer and pre-emergent herbicide in the spring, which I would definitely agree with. In that case, if you are using exclusively pre-emergent and no fertilizer in the spring, what would be your recommendations as far as timing of that? I would assume I can apply that quite a bit earlier than I would be waiting for something that contains a fertilizer. It obviously is related to microbial breakdown of products, so early is fine, I would assume.
Yeah, so there's some I apologize if you hear some humming. My radiator in my office is humming as it's trying to heat my room. So there's generally there's good consensus that yes, these pre-emergent herbicides are broken down by microbes. So if we go earlier, then and since the soils are still cold, if I put it out on March 1 versus March 15 versus April 1 versus April 15, as long as all those dates are before crabgrass germinates, then all of them should be effective. And I would say generally the research says that. But the concern with that is that even though the soils are cool and there's not a lot of microbial activity, there could be some, and so you could get some breakdown. So for maximum flexibility, yes, if you have a lawn care company and you got 1,000 clients, then by all means just understand that you can get these products out early, and you can get them out a month before crabgrass germinates, and they'll still be very effective.
It would not encourage you to do that if they contain nitrogen, though.
Right, correct. Yeah, and we're just talking here if they do not have nitrogen, just the pre-emergent herbicide by itself. But if you have a smaller set of clients, then in my opinion, it's better to just kind of wait until about 2 or 3 weeks before crabgrass germinates, and then get your application out. And there's some really nice models available to help you predict exactly when crabgrass is going to germinate. You've got the natural model, which where you basically just observe plants out in the landscape. When you see forsythia blooming, you need to get your pre out. When you see red bud bloom, you basically know crabgrass is germinating at that point. Or on a website hosted by Michigan State University, there's a growing degree day tracker. It's just actually gddtracker.net. And that website, you can punch in your zip code, and it shows you a map that shows exactly where crabgrass is germinating. And that one is very accurate because I always pay attention to it every year to see how many days it can within accuracy it can do. And I think my 7 out of 10 years, it's within 2 days of crabgrass germination. And usually it's the years that I see it gets a little bit off, maybe 5 or 6 days off, are more the cooler springs that we have. It seems like the model gets a little off. But in a normal year, that's very accurate at telling you exactly when crabgrass germinates. And if you're at a northern location, you can see that map moving up to where you are, and it's really nice and handy for making sure you get your application out in plenty of time before crabgrass germinates.
So gddtracker.net, in addition to crabgrass germination, just a fantastic website for spring broadleaf weed control applications for a post-emergent standpoint, and also Japanese beetle grub prevention, I believe, Aaron. I don't know how well that's been studied as far as accuracy like you've done with crabgrass, but it's at least it's a start. I think it's a good start for sure.
Yeah, they actually have, I'm looking at the website right now, there are about a dozen different models now. They've just continued to add them. So for the lawn care industry, crabgrass germination, spring broadleaf timing. So when you put out an amine versus an ester is in there. There's also one model called crabgrass pre, where instead of looking at when does crabgrass germinate, it's more guidelines on when should you put down your pre-emergence herbicide. So it's basically a similar model, just meant to put you a couple weeks prior to crabgrass germination. And I also have a bluegrass billbug model on there too, so that if you're having issues with bluegrass billbugs, you can know when to effectively time those applications.
Great stuff. Well, the other topics that I wanted to bring up here, Aaron, I think all kind of relate to just improving applications in general. So I think the adjuvant surfactant topic we could certainly touch on, but I also know you have some information. You talk quite a bit about the influence of spray water quality on some of these applications. So maybe we can get into that also, but let's start with nozzle selection and water rate. So in my mind, pretty good utility type of rate for most of the foliar herbicides that we're using, or foliar absorbed products, would kind of be that, what, half gallon to 1 gallon per 1,000 square feet type of approach there. What would you say is the most appropriate spray rate, Aaron, for herbicide effectiveness? Obviously depends on the products we're using, but I think we can put them into some general groups.
Yeah. So it's a pretty wide range out there for spray volume. So we actually just published some research with broadleaf herbicides to show that you can go all the way down to 11 gallons per acre, which is the 0.25 gallons per 1,000 square feet, all the way up to 2 gallons per 1,000 square feet. So that's an 8-fold difference, and you can get equivalent dandelion and white clover control. So that means that whether you're using a permagreen that puts out a really low spray volume, a Z sprayer, which is right above it, a boom sprayer that may be half or 1 gallon per 1,000 square feet, or a lawn gun, which may be 2 gallons per 1,000 square feet. That's a wide range of spray volumes there. But for broadleaf weeds, all of them can be effective. And so when they go to the high volume, they have a really dilute product going out, but you get really good spray coverage. And when you go to the low volume application, you have a very concentrated spray droplet, and you may not get very many droplets on the weed, but the research shows that those concentrated droplets can still deliver quite a potent dose inside the plant. So on the broadleaf side, a big range out there. Most labels will indicate a pretty wide range works for broadleaf weeds. For pre-emergence crabgrass, then our research also indicates, we haven't done as much research in that area, also a wide range works. Again, you get good coverage. Those products get watered into the soil by rainfall or irrigation, and get slightly distributed through that water to make sure you have good coverage. The only area that I've done research to show that there's a big difference on weed control wise is with some of our post-emergence grass control, particularly with crabgrass. And so for post-emergence crabgrass control, what we've seen is if you get your spray volumes up a little higher, closer to 1 to 2 gallons per 1,000 square feet, then you just get better spray coverage. And that can be important for controlling that big crabgrass, once it gets established onto a site. So there's been some research on this with herbicides. Generally, the research shows pretty wide range of products pretty wide range of nozzles and spray volumes can be effective for your weed control. A few other things you mentioned, I'll try to touch on quickly because we're getting tight on time. Adjuvants. So an adjuvant is, you might call it a spreader sticker or a non-ionic surfactant or a crop oil or methylated seed oil. Those are all types of adjuvants. The simplest thing there is just read the label. If it tells you to use one, use the one the label says. If it doesn't tell you to use one, there's probably no advantage to you adding one to the tank because the manufacturer's done research, and I concur that in my research shows that if the manufacturer says to add one, you'll get benefit from it. If they don't, you won't get any additional benefit from adding one. So save money by not putting one in the tank. In fact, I've seen more cases where you cause turf injury by adding an adjuvant when you're not supposed to than getting increased weed control in that case. Calibration's another thing. Obviously, calibration's really important. So don't forget to have those products calibrated accurately. And there's some references inside your weed control publication. And we'll be sharing some of those recommendations also at the end of the semester here in this class. I know it takes time to read that label, but there's a treasure trove of knowledge in the pesticide label. So if you're using a product frequently, through it and look at all those cautions, look at all those statements that are meant to tell you how to use the product accurately. Remember, the manufacturer wants you to be successful with their product, so you buy more of it. And so they put a lot of things in there to help you be more successful with that product. So it's worth the time to read the label. And then the last thing on spray water quality, briefly, pH, water pH doesn't have a significant impact on the herbicide efficacy when we look at the range of water pHs that we typically have. So I wouldn't really worry about pH too much. I'm more worried about water hardness, particularly with water hardness is, and I've got some text in the book to try to help you understand it. But when you're using glyphosate that we talked about earlier, or some of our broadleaf herbicides, then we can have hard water reduce their efficacy. So that is any formulation of glyphosate and all of our amine formulations of our broadleaf herbicides. So it'd be like Trimec, Triplet, Mecamine D, some of those commonly used broadleaf herbicides that are water soluble. And so if you have hard water, you'll reduce the effectiveness of those herbicides. The good news is the very expensive. You have what we call is a water conditioning agent, which ammonium sulfate is the most common one. Ammonium sulfate is very inexpensive, and you can basically just mix some of that in your spray tank. It's water soluble, so it'll solubilize in your tank, and just a little bit of that, 8.5 pounds per gallon, or 8.5 pounds per 100 gallons is often plenty enough ammonium sulfate to condition that water such that your herbicide will work great. And the cost of that depends on your spray volume, but it's like $1 or $2 per acre. So it's a super cheap addition to your spray tank to make sure those herbicides are working exactly the way you intended them to. So more information on the book on that, or you can reach out to me if you have specific hard water questions. I got another document that I can share with you to help you kind of understand that issue.
All right. Well, great stuff, Aaron. Just want to say I really appreciate you taking the time here out of your busy schedule to catch us on the afternoon here before the weekend. Thanks to those that viewed it live. If anyone has any remaining questions on weed management, by all means, send them to myself, and I can get them to Dr. Patton, or feel free to reach out to him as well individually. So next week, we're on the topic of disease management, insect management. Dr. Paul Koch, Dr. Chris Williamson have a couple of great lectures for us on that. And as always, we'll see everybody next week. Have a great weekend, and see you soon.